Okay, so far in this series, we've seen Jesus' authority over the supernatural. He's cast out demons. He's healed people. Well, in today's reading from Mark 1:35 through 45, Jesus does something really odd. He touches a man with leprosy. This was an act that was clearly against Jewish law. So, did Jesus break the law to heal the leper? Well, let's read and then let's investigate. All right, let's pick up right where we left off in the last episode, reading Mark 1:35 through 45. And rising very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus departed and went out to a desolate place. And there he prayed. And Simon and those who were with him searched for him. And they found him and said to him, "Everyone's looking for you." And he said to them, "Let us go on to the next towns that I may preach there also, for that is why I came out." And he went throughout all Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and casting out demons. And a leper came to him, imploring him, and kneeling, said to him, "If you will, you can make me clean." Moved with pity, he stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, "I will, be clean." And immediately the leprosy left him, and he was made clean. And Jesus sternly charged him and sent him away at once, and said to him, "See that you say nothing to anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest, and offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded, for a proof to them." But he went out and began to talk freely about it, and to spread the news, so that Jesus could no longer openly enter a town, and was out in desolate places, and people were coming to him from every quarter. So it's a really interesting story, maybe one that you've heard before, and there's a really big emphasis on this idea of Jesus reaching out and touching the man with leprosy. What is leprosy to begin with? And why does it really matter to this story? Why doesn't it just say, and then there was another man who had another disease and came to Jesus and Jesus healed him like all the other people, right? It appears like Jesus is healing a lot of people. Why specifically does Mark tell us this story about Jesus touching this man with leprosy? Well, the context is actually really beautiful. It's even poetic. But first, let me give you two highlights about what leprosy actually is. The first is that leprosy is an umbrella term for a highly contagious skin disease. Now, God gave his people, the Israelites, some laws about different skin diseases. You can read about this in the Torah. The Torah is the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And particularly in Leviticus, God gives a lot of different laws about many different things. In Leviticus chapter 13 and 14 are specifically about skin diseases like leprosy. And the whole point of these skin disease, from a practical standpoint, was to avoid the spread of these diseases among each other, right? It's people living in close quarters, they're traveling together, they're washing clothes together, they're around each other all the time. And so God is providing, like, hey, here's the laws, here's the rules about how you should interact with somebody, or how you yourself should handle if you have a skin disease. I'm not going to read chapters in 13 and 14, but you should go read it because it's very, very interesting. But I do want to read the end of chapter 13, or near the end. This is Leviticus 13:45 through 46. This is God saying to Moses, and Moses to the people, "Anyone with such a defiling disease must wear torn clothes. Let their hair be unkempt, cover the lower part of their face, and cry out, 'Unclean, unclean.' As long as they have the disease, they remain unclean. They must live alone. They must live outside the camp." So, in order to avoid the spread, God is saying to Moses and Moses to the people that they should identify themselves with torn clothes, unkempt hair, covering the lower part of their face, and cry out to people who are coming near them, "I'm unclean, stay away, stay away." In fact, the cleansing process for someone who had to live alone and live outside the camp because of a disease like this was actually very complicated. Let me read just a little bit from chapter 14, Leviticus 14, 8 and 9. God to Moses, and again, Moses to the people. God says, the person with this disease, the person is to be cleansed, must wash their clothes, must shave off all their hair and bathe with water. Then they will be ceremonially clean. After this, they may come into the camp, but they must stay outside their tent for 7 days. On the 7th day, they must shave off all their hair. They must shave their head, their beard, their eyebrows, and the rest of their hair. They must wash their clothes and bathe themselves with water, and they will be clean. So it's like very complicated. And this is just a little snapshot of all that they had to do. Then they had to go offer all these different sacrifices. It was just very complicated. The whole point, though, is that because leprosy is this umbrella term for a highly contagious skin disease, God is providing these laws to prevent the spread. But it's so much more than that. The second highlight about leprosy is that leprosy was used by God as an analogy for sin, right? More than it just being a contagious skin disease that you wouldn't want to spread among families and throughout the whole nation. Leprosy, or these skin diseases, were considered unholy by God. In the book of Numbers, chapter 5, God reiterates his view on leprosy and how the Israelites should view it. So let me read just these first 3 verses of Numbers chapter 5. The Lord said to Moses, "Command the Israelites to send away from the camp anyone who has a defiling skin disease or a discharge of any kind, or who is ceremonially unclean because of a dead body. Send away male and female alike. Send them outside the camp so they will not defile their camp where I dwell among them." So this last part we're saying, because I live there, God is viewing these skin diseases and other things that make people unclean as unholy and unfit. They're defiling because of his presence in the camp. In his presence, you can't have this can't have this skin disease. Well, notice that nobody was above the law. Okay, this was Numbers chapter 5. It says male and female alike. There's really no discrimination here. But even more than that, a few chapters later in Numbers chapter 12, there's an incident between some of the leaders of Israel involving a consequence of leprosy. Okay, and I thought about how to do this. I thought about reading just part of it and describing the story to you, but I think it'd be even more impactful if I just read most all of Numbers chapter 12. It's only about 15 or 16 verses, but this is a interaction between Moses, who was the leader of the Israelites, and 2 other leaders. One, his older sister Miriam, who was a prophetess among the Israelites, as well as his older brother Aaron, who was the high priest. Okay, so this family is a family who's leading the nation, and there's a little bit of trouble and tension between them. So, Numbers chapter 12, verse 1. Miriam and Aaron began to talk against Moses because of his Cushite wife, for he had married a Cushite. "Has the Lord spoken only through Moses?" they asked. "Hasn't he also spoken through us?" And the Lord heard this. Now, this is maybe one of the first examples we see of like gossip, and you can just see how it's working. Moses and Aaron are feeling a little bit of envy or jealousy because of Moses, and they're kind of blaming that he's married this Cushite wife, which was a no-no. And all of a sudden, that kind of escalates to even more like, who does he think he is? He walks around, he talks as if, God's only speaking through him, but God speaks through us. God talks to us. Well, God hears this, and there's a problem with it. So verse 3 specifies, it says, "Now Moses was a very humble man, more humble than anyone else on the face of the earth. At once the Lord said to Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, 'Come out to the tent of meeting, all 3 of you.' So the 3 of them went out. Then the Lord came down in a pillar of cloud. He stood at the entrance to the tent and summoned Aaron and Miriam. When the two of them had stepped forward, he said, "Listen to my words. When there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, reveal myself to them in visions. I speak to them in dreams. But this is not true of my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. With him I speak face to face, clearly and not in riddles. He sees the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses?" The anger of the Lord burned against them, and he left them. When the cloud lifted from above the tent, Miriam's skin was leprous. It had become white as snow. Aaron turned toward her and saw that she had a defiling skin disease. And he said to Moses, "Please, my Lord, I ask you not to hold against us the sin we have so foolishly committed. Do not let her be like a stillborn infant coming from its mother's womb with its flesh half eaten away." So Moses cried out to the Lord, "Please, God, heal her." The Lord replied to Moses, "If her father had spit in her face, would she not have been in disgrace for 7 days? Confine her outside the camp for 7 days. After that, she can be brought back." So Miriam was confined outside the camp for 7 days, and the people did not move on till she was brought back. So the story, really interesting, is Moses and Aaron, envious of Moses, speaking out against him, kind of gossiping about him. God calling all three of them like children, come here, we're going to have a conversation about this. He disciplines Aaron and Miriam for their sins, specifically Miriam. Presumably she was the instigator of this. And now her punishment is disgrace. Her punishment is leprosy. Like, she can't be with people. So God is using leprosy here as an analogy for sin. Like leprosy, sin affects more than the infected. Let me say that again. Like leprosy, sin affects more than the infected. Sin is personally irritating. If you've ever seen pictures of anyone with a skin disease like that or with leprosy, it's personally irritating. It's painful, but it's more than that. It's also humiliating. It's isolating. They can't live among people. So sin is irritating. Sin is humiliating. It's isolating. It's contagious. It can spread all throughout. And sin cannot exist in the presence of God and in his people. So the consequences there are exile. You have to go outside the camp. And unless you are made clean, you can't come back in. It's isolation, exile, leading to death. So there's a little bit of context about leprosy. So our question, though, is when Jesus reaches out and he touches the man with leprosy, did Jesus break the law? Well, what's interesting is what happens. See, when Jesus encountered leprosy, it had the reverse effect. Leprosy would have been transferred from one person to another, the germs, the bacteria, whatever it is that causes the contagious spread of it. And yet it has the reverse effect. See, when Jesus touched the man with leprosy, his leprosy and his uncleanness did not spread to Jesus. Instead, Jesus' purity, Jesus' cleanness spread to the man. Jesus didn't break the law. He showed a new way to be clean of sin before God. That was the whole point of it. Isn't that amazing? See, the story isn't over yet. The man's response and the consequences of how the man responded really punctuates the whole story. Consider verse 45. Jesus had told the man to be quiet, not to talk about it, but the man went out and began to talk freely about it and to spread the news so that Jesus could no longer openly enter a town, but was out in desolate places and people were coming out to him. Consider the man's response in light of how we talked about how the demons responded. Remember in the previous episode, when Jesus commanded the demons to come out of the man, he said to them to be silent, and they were. But when Jesus commands this man to not talk about it, he goes out and starts telling everybody. I mean, the demons had more respect for Jesus' authority than the man did. And because of the man's disobedience to Jesus, it really kind of messed with Jesus' plan. Remember, Jesus was planning to go from village to village and preach and teach and share. But instead, because the man did this, Jesus had to stay out in isolation. And this is to me the poetic part of it, is that because Jesus so cared about the man and so wanted the man to be healed and so wanted the man to be pure and so wanted the man to be clean and so wanted the man to be back in the community where he could live again, Jesus was willing to trade places with the man. This man with leprosy was out in isolation, and because Jesus gave him his purity, gave him his cleanness, and spread that to the man was now able to go in and live in the community. But Jesus, who had been in the community, now had to go out into isolation, into desolate places. Isn't that amazing? You see, this is compassion. This is ultimately foreshadowing Jesus' crucifixion. Jesus was crucified outside the city. Jesus was crucified out in shame, stripped naked, nailed to a cross, publicly humiliated, exiled away from the community. All because he so loved each one of us. He wanted his purity and his cleanness to transfer to all of those who would accept him. And he did so by taking on all of our sin. It's really a beautiful thing, but the man's disobedience ultimately didn't stop Jesus' plans. Like, news of Jesus spread all throughout Galilee, and I'll say this again, if Mark's story wasn't true, it really wouldn't have circulated. We wouldn't still be reading it today. But I want you to know this, is that sin is like leprosy for your soul. It is tearing away at your soul. It is eating away at it. It is separating you from the relationships. It is separating you from people that you love. It's separating you from God, the one who gives life, and ultimately sin will kill you. It will destroy you. It will lead to the death of your soul. Except if you believe in Jesus and you allow him to touch you and make you clean, to reach out in compassion and transfer all of his cleanness and all of his purity to you, while he takes on all of your sin and takes the blame for it. So I hope that you will trust in Jesus. Ultimately, I want to help you make an informed decision about him. And as we're talking about miracles, there's something that is absolutely awesome about the miracles that Jesus does. They're not magic tricks. He's trying to help people understand a reality. And that's where we're going to pick up in the next episode. When the next episode is available, you can find it right there.